The neighbor's dog. When the family moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood, they were excited. It was a fresh start, a new house, new surroundings, and a chance to make new memories. The house, though modest, had a charm to it that made it feel like home from the moment they walked in. The front yard was overgrown with ivy, and the backyard stretched out with a sprawling garden that seemed perfect for their two young children, Sam and Lily, to play in. It wasn't long after they settled in that they noticed the dog. It wasn't unusual for strays to wander into the neighborhood, but this dog was different. Unlike the usual scruffy mutts that roamed the streets looking for scraps, this one was clean and well-groomed, with thick black fur that shone in the sunlight. Its eyes were a deep, unsettling shade of amber, bright and intense, and whenever it looked at them, they felt as though it were peering into their very souls. The dog was always calm, but there was a sadness in the way it moved, as though it carried a burden too heavy to bear. It appeared on their doorstep one afternoon, looking up at them with its unblinking gaze. It was as if it had always been there, waiting for them. Sam was the first to approach, a friendly smile spreading across his face as he bent down to pet the animal. The dog didn't shy away. Instead, it lowered its head, allowing Sam to stroke its fur. "We should keep it," Sam said, his voice full of hope. His parents, though initially hesitant, were won over by the dog's quiet demeanor and gentle nature. They decided to take it in. The kids named it Max, after Sam's favorite superhero, and it quickly became a beloved member of the family. Max would follow them around the house, curling up beside them as they watched TV or read books. He was the perfect companion, loyal, affectionate, and always there when they needed him. But there was something unsettling about Max. At night he would sit at the window, staring at the neighbor's house across the street. His gaze was unwavering, and no matter how many times they called to him, Max wouldn't move. His amber eyes were fixed on the house, as if he were waiting for something. At first the family dismissed it as a quirk. Dogs sometimes fixate on strange things, right? But then came the growling. It started one evening when the family was sitting down to dinner. They had just finished eating when the low, rumbling growl echoed from the living room. Max was standing near the window, his body tense, his eyes locked onto the house across the street. His growl was barely audible, but it had a menacing quality that sent a shiver down their spines. "Max, stop that!" the mother Karen called out. But the dog didn't listen. His growl deepened, rising in volume and intensity, as though he was preparing to attack something unseen. The kids, uneasy, crept closer to their mother. "Maybe he's just nervous," the father Greg suggested, trying to calm them. "He's still getting used to the new place." But that didn't explain why Max only growled at night, or why his gaze was so focused on the house next door. It became a nightly routine. At dusk, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the world outside grew dark, Max would position himself by the window, staring at the neighbor's house. The growling would start low and grow in volume as the night wore on, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the walls of their house. It was as though the dog was warning them of something, or someone. One morning, weeks later, Karen stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper. Her heart sank when she saw the neighbor's house. The blinds were drawn, the porch empty, and there were no signs of life. The grass had started to grow wild, the mailbox was full, and there was an eerie quiet about the place. She noticed the dog, too. Max was standing at the same spot by the window, staring at the house with his intense amber eyes. But this time, he wasn't growling. He was silent, still, as though he were waiting for something to happen. That afternoon, Greg went over to the neighbor's house to check on Mr. Collins, the man who had lived there for years. The neighbors had always been polite but distant, exchanging pleasantries but rarely socializing. Greg knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried the doorbell, knocked again, and even peered through the window, but nothing. The house felt empty, abandoned. He returned home that evening, an unsettling feeling gnawing at him. "Where's Mr. Collins?" Karen asked as he walked through the door. "I don't know," Greg replied, his voice tight. "I tried his door, but no one's home. The place looks empty." "Maybe he went on vacation," Karen suggested, though there was a nervousness in her tone. That night, Max's behavior changed. As usual, he was sitting by the window, staring at the neighbor's house. But this time, the growling was louder, more frantic. It wasn't like the usual low rumbling. It was almost like a bark, sharp and guttural, mixed with a sense of urgency. Max's body was stiff, his tail raised in alert. He began pacing the living room, his eyes darting between the window and the door as if trying to decide whether to go outside. "Max, stop it," Karen called, her voice trembling. But Max ignored her, growling more forcefully now, his eyes fixed on the neighbor's house. Suddenly, Max bolted for the door, scratching at it, whimpering, his body trembling. Karen, startled, hurried to open it, and the dog shot out into the backyard, his nose to the ground, sniffing frantically. "Where is he going?" Sam asked from the living room, his eyes wide with confusion. "I don't know," Greg said, frowning, "but I don't like this." Max ran around the backyard in circles, his paws kicking up dirt, his growl now a low, continuous hum. The family watched from the window as he stopped by the far corner of the yard, where the old wooden fence met the trees. The dog's tail was rigid, his eyes locked on the ground. Then, as if following an invisible command, he began digging, furiously, frantically. "Max, no!" Karen yelled, rushing to the door. But it was too late. Max had already dug down deep into the dirt. His paws moved faster and faster, sending clumps of soil flying in all directions. The family watched in stunned silence, unable to stop him. And then, suddenly, Max stopped. His head lifted from the hole, his eyes wide and unblinking. A sharp bark escaped his throat, and he retreated a few paces, his body low to the ground, as though something unseen had startled him. Greg stepped forward cautiously, his heart racing. He approached the hole, crouching down to peer inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, buried beneath the earth, was a dark, crumpled object, an old coat, now stained and torn. It wasn't just a coat. It was a human hand, pale and lifeless, sticking out of the ground. The family froze. The air around them seemed to grow colder, the silence suffocating. Max began to whimper softly, his tail between his legs, eyes darting nervously to the neighbor's house. It was then that Greg remembered something Mr. Collins had once told him when they first moved in. "This dog," he had said, his voice low and gravelly. "He's mine. He was always mine. He just doesn't know it yet." But Greg knew now. Max hadn't just been staring at the neighbor's house. He had been guarding it. The face in the fog. It was late, much later than Martin had intended to be out on the road. He had left the office hours ago, but a last-minute email had kept him at his desk longer than expected. Now, driving home, the clock on the dashboard blinked a reminder that it was nearly 1 in the morning. He yawned and gripped the wheel tighter, the headlights slicing through the thick veil of fog that had descended over the highway. The weather had taken an unexpected turn when the temperature dropped sharply, and the fog rolled in as if summoned by something unseen. The road was quiet, too quiet. It was one of those stretches of highway where there was nothing but darkness and the occasional flicker of a streetlight in the distance. He wasn't exactly nervous, but the weight of the fog pressing against the windows had a way of making everything feel just a bit off. He knew it wasn't a safe idea to keep driving, but he figured he was already halfway home and couldn't afford to pull over at some random rest stop in the middle of nowhere. The car hummed steadily as he drove, trying to focus on the road. He kept his eyes on the thick mist ahead, barely able to see beyond the reach of his headlights. The fog seemed to swallow the road, creating a distorted version of reality where everything was muted, like the world had been muffled. A chill crept into the air, seeping through the cracks of his car. He tried to ignore it, but it persisted, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. And then he saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. It was an impossibly tall silhouette, dark and still, as if carved from the fog itself. Martin's heart lurched in his chest, his foot slamming down on the brake. He had just a split second to react, and instinctively he swerved to the left, his tires screeching against the wet pavement. The car fishtailed, spinning uncontrollably as his hands fought the wheel, but it was no use. The last thing he saw was the figure standing motionless in the road before his vision blurred, the world collapsing around him in a deafening crash. When Martin regained consciousness, his head throbbed and the sound of his heartbeat pulsed in his ears. The car was still, its engine idling weakly. His fingers grazed his forehead, finding blood, sticky and warm. He groaned, disoriented, and slowly opened his eyes, blinking away the fog that had settled in his mind. Everything around him was still shrouded in a thick, suffocating mist, the kind that made it feel like he was trapped inside some strange dream. He was alive, but something felt terribly wrong. His first instinct was to check for injuries. His seatbelt was still fastened, and he was slumped against the door, but he didn't feel any serious pain. His hands gripped the steering wheel, the leather slick with his blood. He took a deep breath and looked around. There was no sign of the figure. The road was empty, just the endless stretch of fog surrounding him in all directions. But as he sat there trying to steady his breath, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They circled his car, stepping in rhythm with the uneven hum of the engine. A soft shuffle, as if something, or someone, was moving just outside the reach of his headlights. Martin's pulse quickened. He glanced through the fogged-up windows, his eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing to be seen. The footsteps stopped, only to begin again, closer this time. They circled, always just beyond his line of sight, as if whatever it was studying him, watching him. His breath caught in his throat. The sound of footsteps was unmistakable, and yet there was no one in sight. He couldn't understand how it was possible. There was nothing out there except the fog. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled again, and he turned his head slowly, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. There, standing in the fog behind him, was a face. A face. It was pale, its features obscured by the mist, but Martin could see enough to know it wasn't human. Its eyes were wide and dark, hollow pits that seemed to draw him in, like two empty windows into a void. Its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, too wide to be real. The fog seemed to bend around it, as if the figure was made from the very mist itself. Frozen in terror, Martin couldn't move. His heart hammered in his chest, his hands shaking as they gripped the steering wheel. The face leaned closer, its grin widening, the eyes never leaving him, and for a split second, he swore he saw it blink. He slammed his foot on the accelerator without thinking, the car lurching forward with a screech of tires. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, the face was gone. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He drove faster now, the headlights illuminating nothing but a dense, swirling fog. The footsteps followed, relentless. They echoed in the silence of the car, a constant reminder that whatever was out there was not finished with him. The car bounced over potholes and uneven ground, but no matter how fast he drove, no matter how much he tried to escape, The footsteps never stopped. They were always there, circling, waiting, closing in. The road stretched on endlessly, with no sign of any other vehicles, no exit signs, no familiar landmarks, just the fog and the footsteps. He glanced at the rearview mirror again. This time there was nothing there, no face, no figure, but something inside him told him that it wasn't over. Not yet. Suddenly the sound of footsteps grew louder, faster. They were no longer circling. Now they were coming toward him, one step after another, growing closer and closer. His eyes widened in panic, and he looked ahead, his breath coming in shallow gasps, as the road ahead of him seemed to stretch infinitely into the mist. Then he saw it, a shape emerging through the fog. A figure, tall and indistinct, moving steadily toward him. Martin's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles white as he struggled to keep control of the car. His mind raced, desperate for any sign of salvation. But the fog had swallowed everything. There was nothing left but the figure and the sound of its footsteps, now thundering louder in his ears. The figure reached the car, and Martin froze. It was standing right next to him, its shape indistinguishable in the mist. He could feel it, hear it breathing. Slowly, his eyes turned toward the passenger side window, and there, inches away, was the face again. Pale, twisted, its smile stretching impossibly wide, its eyes empty voids. The last thing Martin remembered was the sound of his own scream, echoing in the fog, before the world went black. When he woke up, it was daylight. The fog had lifted, and the road was clear. His car was intact, parked on the shoulder of the highway as if nothing had happened. No crash, no footsteps, no figure. But as he looked around, a cold chill washed over him. There, just at the edge of his vision, he saw it. A figure standing in the mist, its face twisted into a grin. And he knew, deep in his bones, that it was still following him. The Cursed Library Book. Marissa had always loved books, a love that started when she was just a child, thumbing through pages late at night, letting her imagination be swept away to fantastical worlds. She often visited the old library downtown, an imposing brick building with a smell of must and dust, its aisles lined with books that seemed older than time itself. There was something about its labyrinthine layout and its quiet atmosphere that made it feel like a place of secrets, a place where stories never really ended. It was the perfect refuge for someone like her, who preferred the company of pages over people. One dreary Saturday afternoon, as the clouds outside hung heavy and gray, Marissa wandered through the aisles of the library, her fingers tracing the spines of countless books. She wasn't searching for anything in particular, just letting her feet lead her through the aisles like a person drawn to the unknown. That was when she found it. It was an old, leather-bound book tucked away on the top shelf of a darkened corner. Its cover was worn, the title faded, and there was no author's name on the spine. A sense of curiosity rose in her chest. She reached for it, dusting off the thick layer of grime that had settled on its surface. The moment her fingers brushed against the cover, she felt a strange, almost electric tingle run through her fingertips. She hesitated for a moment, unsure why she felt this strange compulsion to hold it. But then, with a quick breath, she pulled the book from its shelf and opened it. The pages were yellowed, fragile like they might crumble at the slightest touch. As Marissa flipped through them, she noticed the book had no publisher, no date. It was as though it had appeared out of nowhere. But despite the peculiarities, something about it drew her in. She glanced around the library, noting that no one else seemed to be around, as though the building had fallen silent in response to the book's presence. It felt like she was meant to find it. Taking it to the counter, the librarian, a thin, elderly woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, eyed the book with a wary expression. She hesitated before scanning it into the system, as though she were contemplating saying something, but then she simply handed it over. "Enjoy your reading," she said, her voice soft and tinged with something Marissa couldn't quite place. As Marissa left the library, the book in her bag seemed to pulse with an energy that made her skin prickle. It was as though it were calling to her, urging her to start reading immediately. She tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to her overactive imagination, but the strange sensation lingered, clinging to her every step. When she got home, Marissa sat down in her favorite armchair by the window, the heavy book in her hands. She opened it again, the pages whispering as they turned. The book was divided into several short chapters, but there was no clear narrative thread. Just odd, disjointed stories that seemed to be written in a rush, as though the author had been trying to get something out of their head. She found it a bit strange, but thought little of it. It was when she reached page 66 that something unusual caught her eye. Handwritten in the margin, in dark, spidery script, were the words, "Do not read past this page." Marissa blinked, her eyes moving back and forth across the sentence. She felt a shiver run through her spine, a sense of dread that she couldn't explain. Why would someone leave such a warning? Was it part of the story? She couldn't be sure. For a moment she considered putting the book down and returning it to the library. But then a surge of defiance rose within her. She didn't believe in such superstitions. After all, it was just a book, an old one, but still just fiction. She could handle whatever came next. Ignoring the warning, she turned the page. At first, nothing seemed different. The story continued in its bizarre, fragmented style, though Marissa noticed that the events within the pages seemed increasingly darker. The characters seemed more real, almost too real, and the situations they found themselves in began to feel uncomfortably close to her own life. There was a young woman in the book who was alone in a large, creaky house, just as Marissa was in her apartment. She was reading a book, just like Marissa, when strange things began to happen. Faint noises in the walls, whispers from the shadows. As the woman read, the events in the book mirrored her own, becoming eerily accurate. Marissa's pulse quickened as she turned the pages. She continued to read, unable to stop herself. The story grew darker, the woman in the book becoming more frantic as the lines between reality and fiction blurred. There was one chapter where the woman began to hear strange knocking sounds in the night, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. Marissa glanced around her apartment nervously. Her lights flickered once, then again, and she stiffened. The story described a cold, creeping sensation in the air, and just as she read the words, Marissa felt the temperature in her apartment drop. The knocking in the book grew more insistent. Marissa could hear it too. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The noise was coming from the wall just behind her. The same knock followed by a strange, dragging sound. Her breath caught in her throat as she set the book down, her hands trembling. She stood up and walked cautiously to the wall. There was nothing there. The knocking stopped. Shaking her head, she tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, that it was all a coincidence. But when she returned to the chair, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The days that followed were filled with similar occurrences. Strange whispers in the corners of her apartment, the feeling that someone, or something, was always just behind her, watching her every move. Each time she thought it was just her nerves, the book seemed to make the unease worse, as though it were feeding off her fear. Her sleep became restless, full of strange, half-formed dreams that mirrored the events in the story. The knocking, the dragging sound, the cold air, it was all happening around her, just as it had happened to the woman in the book. One night, as Marissa lay in bed, she thought she heard the faintest whisper, coming from the pages of the book, still lying on her desk across the room. She got out of bed and walked toward it, drawn by an unseen force. When she opened the book, the pages turned on their own, stopping at page 99. Her stomach turned as she read the new passage. The woman in the story had found the book, just as she had, and had begun to read it, but she couldn't stop herself. The further she went, the closer she got to the dark presence that had been lurking at the edges of her reality. The same presence that was now stalking Marissa. Marissa slammed the book shut, but the damage had already been done. The next few days were a blur of paranoia, fear, and dread. She stopped leaving her apartment, terrified that the events in the book would come to life. But one morning, as she sat in the kitchen with the curtains drawn, the knocking came again. It was louder now, coming from inside her apartment. She couldn't breathe. It was real. The next thing she knew, she was standing in front of the library. The book was gone, vanished, as though it had never been there at all. She could still hear the knocking, feel the cold creeping up her spine. She had returned it, but the curse was still with her, wrapping its cold fingers around her heart. The librarian watched her with a knowing look. Marissa tried to speak, to ask about the book, but the words wouldn't come. There was only silence, thick and suffocating, as the reality of her situation set in. She had read past page 66, and now the story had become her own. The shadow beneath the door. It started with whispers. At first, David and Laura thought nothing of it. Their 6-year-old son, Ethan, had always had an active imagination, prone to sleep-talking and strange dreams. But when he began whispering to someone unseen under his bed, they grew uneasy. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" Laura asked one night as she tucked him in. Ethan looked up at her with wide, serious eyes. "The Shadow Man. He lives under my bed." Laura forced a smile, brushing his hair back. "Sweetie, there's no such thing as a shadow man. It's just your imagination." Ethan only frowned. "But he talks to me. He says he's waiting." That night, as Laura relayed the conversation to David, they both laughed it off. "Every kid has an imaginary friend at some point," David said, flipping through the channels on the TV. "It's probably just something he picked up from a story." But then came the scratching. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling sound at night, like nails against wood. Laura checked Ethan's bed for mice, but there were none. Then, as the nights passed, the sound grew louder, more insistent. One evening, as Laura passed by Ethan's room, she noticed something odd. His bedroom door was slightly ajar, and a dark shape stretched out from the crack beneath it. A long humanoid shadow, its fingers clawing at the floorboards. She froze. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it slithered back under the door. The scratching stopped. Laura barely slept that night. She told David the next morning, but he waved it off, saying it was probably a trick of the light. But Laura knew what she had seen. Ethan grew quieter, paler. He no longer played with his toys or talked as much. When Laura tried to press him about the Shadow Man, he only shook his head. He says he's almost ready. Ready for what? That night, David decided to put an end to the nonsense. He placed a baby monitor in Ethan's room and stayed up to listen. At 2:13 a.m., a whisper crackled through the speaker. "He's coming." David shot up in bed, his heart hammering. He rushed to Ethan's room, throwing the door open. The room was dark, but in the dim glow of the nightlight, he saw movement. Something was crawling out from beneath the bed, a mass of shadow, elongated limbs pulling its form into the light. The fingers were too long, the body unnaturally thin. Its hollow face turned toward David. Ethan whimpered from under the blankets. "Daddy, he's here." David lunged for his son, yanking him from the bed just as the thing reached out. He ran, holding Ethan tight, screaming for Laura to get out of the house. Behind him, the thing dragged itself fully into the room. The last thing David saw before slamming the door was its wide, lipless grin. They never went back to that house. The next day, they packed their things and left, leaving everything behind, including the bed. Weeks later, a family moved in, a couple with a young daughter. And one night, as they tucked her in, she whispered to her mother, "The shadow man says he's waiting. The reflection that doesn't match." Emily had always been the type to appreciate the small things. The little quirks of her day, the quiet moments of stillness she found in her own company, were things she cherished. There was a rhythm to her life, an almost comforting monotony, until the day she noticed it. It started with something so subtle she almost dismissed it. One evening, as she was brushing her teeth before bed, Emily caught a glimpse of herself in the bathroom mirror. For a moment, her reflection blinked a fraction of a second later than she did. It was barely perceptible, like a shadow trailing behind her, but it unsettled her. She paused, staring at her reflection, trying to rationalize it. Maybe the lighting had played a trick on her. Maybe it was just a fluke. The next day, it happened again. As she applied her makeup, she noticed her reflection was a beat behind, blinking just a bit later, moving a moment too slow. The difference was small, but the more Emily thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was nothing. After all, mirrors could distort perception in strange ways, right? But then, it began to get worse. It wasn't just the blinking anymore. One evening, after work, Emily walked into her bedroom and caught a glimpse of herself in the full-length mirror. She smiled at her reflection, a soft curve of her lips, but the reflection didn't smile back immediately. It took a few moments before the reflection's mouth began to curl into a smile of its own, as if it were waiting for the right moment to mimic her expression. The smile didn't feel right. It wasn't like the one Emily had worn. It was too wide, too sharp, as if something was holding it in place. She turned away from the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the chill in the air now, as if the room itself had grown colder. Days passed, and the occurrences became more frequent. The delays grew longer. Emily would wave, and the reflection would follow, but with an almost unsettling slowness. Her movements would seem fluid, but the reflections would be stilted, jerking awkwardly to catch up with her. One evening, while cooking dinner, she noticed her reflection was chopping vegetables with a deliberate, almost calculated precision that she herself hadn't used. The reflection's knife moved in sharp, unnatural angles, almost as if it were enjoying the rhythm it had created. Emily's stomach turned. Something was wrong. And then one day, as she stood before the mirror, brushing her hair, she watched as her reflection tilted its head slightly to the side. It was a motion she hadn't made herself. It wasn't a natural shift. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, staring at her own reflection that somehow no longer felt like her own. The reflection smiled again, but this time it wasn't her smile. The corners of its mouth curled upward, stretching too far, too wide, unnaturally so. It looked at her with a strange, knowing gleam in its eyes. Emily's pulse quickened, her skin prickling. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the glass, as if doing so might break the illusion. But the reflection didn't move in sync with her. Instead, it leaned forward, closer to the glass, closer to her. Its eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that felt suffocating, as though it were not her own eyes anymore, but someone else's, someone unfamiliar. "Emily," it whispered, its voice soft, but unmistakably hers. The words sent a chill down her spine, and she recoiled, stumbling back from the mirror. Her breath came in shallow gasps as her heart raced. She wasn't sure if she had heard it correctly. Maybe it was just a figment of her imagination, a trick of the mind playing on her fear. She blinked, hard, trying to shake off the anxiety that had suddenly gripped her. But then it happened again. The reflection's lips moved. "It's my turn now." Her mind reeled. She couldn't breathe, her vision swimming as the reflection seemed to smile wider, too wide, too sharp. It leaned forward once more, pressing against the glass as if trying to reach through, as if the mirror were no longer an obstacle. Emily stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her. She fell to the floor, gasping for air. The reflection, no, it, wasn't like her anymore. It wasn't her reflection. It was something else, something waiting. Her thoughts raced. What did it mean? What was happening? The room felt colder still, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. Emily's breath fogged in the air as she stood shakily to her feet, her heart hammering. She backed away from the mirror, not daring to take her eyes off it. Suddenly, the reflection, no, it wasn't her reflection, stepped out of the mirror. It was as though the glass had melted away, the boundary between her and the thing in the mirror collapsing. The figure was her height, her body, but its features were all wrong. Too perfect, too still, as if it were made of porcelain or something else entirely. Its eyes gleamed with that same unsettling knowledge, and its smile, her smile, was stretched too wide, too sharp. "It's my turn now," the figure repeated, its voice echoing in the room as though there were multiple voices all speaking at once, a chorus of whispers. Emily took a step back, then another. Her mind was frozen in disbelief. The figure reached out, its hand inching closer to her, its fingers long and cold. She could feel the air shift as it moved, an icy current washing over her. She screamed, a raw, unbridled sound that filled the room, but the figure didn't flinch. It just stood there, smiling. The reflection, it, stepped forward, its eyes never leaving hers, and then, without another word, it placed its hand on Emily's shoulder. The touch was cold, dead cold, like ice. "You've had your time, Emily," it whispered. "Now it's mine." With that, Emily's vision blurred. The world around her spun as everything seemed to collapse in on itself. Her reflection, or whatever it was now, took her place. It became her. The last thing Emily felt before everything went dark was the chilling sensation of being trapped, of being locked inside a body that wasn't hers. And somewhere deep inside her mind, a voice whispered, "It's my turn now."